Watch the mercury rise as the pressure of the narrative builds toward an explosive and unforgettable conclusion. This is high-stakes drama at its finest, where every second counts and every word matters. Hit subscribe now and witness the breaking point of the truth as it unfolds.
The locksmith was already packing up his van when I pulled into my own driveway, and the first thing I felt was confusion, not anger. I'd been gone 11 days. My grandmother's funeral was in Tucson, and afterward I stayed to settle her estate, which mostly meant sitting in a lawyer's office, signing things and trying not to cry in front of strangers. I came home to a man in a gray uniform writing on a clipboard against the hood of his truck, and a strange minivan parked where my car usually went. He looked up when I cut my engine. "You the new tenant?" he asked. "I'm the owner," I said. He squinted at his clipboard. "Huh." Lady inside said the place was hers, paid cash for the rekey. He shrugged, the universal shrug of a man who gets paid no matter whose lock he's drilling. He'd already gone. I sat there in my driveway for a second, the engine ticking as it cooled, watching the front door of the house I closed on 14 months ago. It was my brother's wife who answered when I knocked. Brenna. She opened my front door about 6 inches and stood in the gap with her hip cocked against the frame like she'd lived there for years. Behind her, I could see boxes stacked in my entryway, a child's scooter on its side, and a smell I didn't recognize coming out of my house. Fried food and somebody else's laundry. "Oh," she said. "We thought you weren't back until the weekend." I want to be honest about what happened in my body in that moment, because I've replayed it 100 times. My hand was still raised from knocking. My keys were in my other hand, and I remember the little metal teeth biting into my palm because I'd closed my fist around them. The thing that hit me first wasn't even rage. It was this animal disorientation, like when you reach for the last step on a staircase and it isn't there. My own door, her hip against my door frame. "Where's my brother?" I said. Not a question. "Calvin's at work." She said his name like I was the one being unreasonable. "Look, I know this is a lot, but your mom said you'd be fine with it. We've been in a really bad spot and you've got this whole big place to yourself and—" Brenna, open the door. The baby sleeping. I have never in my life wanted to push someone the way I wanted to push that door. But there were kids in there. That's the thing they were counting on, although I didn't fully understand that yet. There were kids in there, and so I stood on my own porch with my own keys in my hand, and I did not put my shoulder into that door, and that single fact, that I am the kind of person who won't shove past a woman holding a door frame, was the whole reason this had happened to me. I should explain about my mother because Brenna invoked her like a permission slip, and she wasn't wrong to. My mom has spent 30 years dividing the world into Calvin and me. Calvin is the warm one, the one who needed things. I was the one who managed. When our dad left, I was 11 and Calvin was 8, and somewhere in the chaos of that year, I became the kid who didn't add to the pile. Good grades, no drama, a job at 16. My mother used to introduce me to people by saying, "This one I never have to worry about," and for a long time I thought that was love. It took me until I was 31, standing on that porch, to understand that "I never have to worry about you" is not the same thing as "I care what happens to you." It just means you've made yourself useful enough to ignore. Brenna let me in eventually, but only after she called my mother, who arrived 20 minutes later in a flurry of righteousness with a casserole dish she had not been asked to bring. "Don't you dare make a scene," was the first thing my mother said to me. Not hello, not how was the funeral, was the service nice, did you sleep? She set the casserole on my kitchen counter, which was already covered in someone else's dishes, and turned to face me with her arms crossed. "These are your nephews. This is your family, and you have 3 bedrooms and nobody in them. 2 of those bedrooms have nobody in them because I work from one and the other is an office," I said. "Mom, they changed my locks. Because you weren't here and Calvin couldn't keep running back and forth to let the kids in." She said it so smoothly that for one vertiginous second it almost sounded reasonable. That's a talent some people have. They can describe a crime to you in the cadence of a favor. Here's what had actually happened, which I pieced together over the following hour while my 2 nephews watched cartoons at full volume in my living room and my sister-in-law made coffee in my kitchen with my beans without asking. Calvin and Brenna had been evicted. This was the 3rd time, though I only learned the full count later. They'd been staying with my mother, but my mother lives in a 1-bedroom and her patience for a 4 and 6-year-old is roughly 48 hours. So my mother had let them into my house. She still had the spare key I'd given her after my surgery 2 years ago. For emergencies, the kind of key you hand to a parent and never think about again. She used it to let a locksmith in. She told him the house belonged to her daughter-in-law. And then the four of them, Calvin, Brenna, and the two boys, moved in, with my mother's blessing, while I was burying my grandmother. "It's just temporary," my mother said. "What's temporary? A week? A month?" She didn't answer that, and the silence was the answer. "I want to tell you that I lost it. That I screamed, that I called the police right there in my kitchen, that I threw the casserole in the trash and the four of them out on the lawn. I think about that version of me a lot. She would have felt better that night. But I'd been a property manager for 6 years before I moved into corporate real estate, and I knew exactly what would happen if I called the cops with two small children asleep in the house. I'd worked enough of these. The officers would show up, they would establish that there were minors present, they would establish that there was a family dispute over occupancy, and they would tell me kindly that this was a civil matter. Squatters with kids in a residence is a civil matter in this state. They would tell me to talk to a lawyer. And then they would leave, and I would be standing in my own kitchen at midnight, having accomplished nothing except teaching my mother that I would huff and threaten and then back down, which is what she had spent 30 years training me to do. So I didn't call the police, not yet. I want to be clear that I thought about it, because half the people who hear this story ask me why I didn't, and the answer is that I knew the law better than my anger did. What I did instead was smile. "You're right," I said to my mother. "I'm sorry. The funeral has me all turned around. Of course they can stay." I have never seen relief land on a face so fast. My mother actually softened, actually reached out and squeezed my arm and said, "There she is. There's my girl who never makes a fuss." And Brenna, from the kitchen, called out something about how she knew I'd understand, how Calvin always said I had the biggest heart. I let all of it wash over me. I was already somewhere else, somewhere cold and clear and quiet. The place I go when I'm solving a problem and the solution has just shown itself in full. Because here's the thing my mother and Brenna didn't understand about what they'd done. They thought they'd put me in an impossible position, that I couldn't throw out children, couldn't be the villain, couldn't undo a thing that was already done. They thought the kids were their shield, and they were right that I wouldn't drag a 4-year-old onto a lawn. But they hadn't moved into my house as squatters anymore. The moment I said, "Of course they can stay," I had a different idea, and that idea was a door, and I was already walking through it. I stayed 2 nights. I slept in my own office on an air mattress because Brenna had taken the master bedroom, my bedroom, with my bed, and I let her because I needed her comfortable. I needed all of them comfortable. Comfortable people don't read the fine print. On the second morning, I made everyone breakfast. I'm not much of a cook, but I can do eggs and bacon for a crowd, and I did, and I sat my brother down at my own kitchen table and I talked to him the way you talk to someone you love. Calvin looks like our father, which my mother has never forgiven him for and never stops loving him for, both at once. He's not a bad man, he's a weak one, which in the long run does more damage because a bad man at least knows what he is. Calvin genuinely believed, sitting at my table eating eggs I cooked, that he was a guy going through a rough patch who deserved a hand from family. He could not see the eviction, the second eviction, the third as a pattern. Each one was a story about a bad landlord, a lost job, a run of luck. Brenna had the same talent as my mother. She could narrate a disaster into an injustice. "I want to actually help," I told him. "Not just let you crash, I mean really set you guys up so you're stable." His eyes welled. "He's an easy crier, my brother. I don't deserve a sister like you." That was true, but not the way he meant it. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said. "I can't just have you living here off the books. My insurance won't cover 4 extra people, and if one of the boys got hurt, I'd be liable, and honestly, the bigger issue is that if you're just informally staying, it looks bad if I ever try to refinance or sell. I need it to be legitimate, so I want to put Brenna on as my property caretaker." Brenna's head came up from her coffee like a deer hearing a branch break. "Caretaker?" "It's a real position," I said. "I've got the rental properties downtown. I do 2 small units I'd been managing on the side, and I need someone local to handle them. Coordinate repairs, do walkthroughs, deal with the small stuff so I don't have to. If I hire you for that, then your housing here becomes part of your compensation. which means it's all legal, it's deductible for me, and I let it hang there because I'd already figured out which hook to bait, and you'd be a W-2 employee. Health insurance, dental, the boys would be covered. I watched it work on her. Brenna had not held a real job since before the first kid. Calvin's hours were unpredictable. I would have bet money neither of those children had been to a dentist in 2 years, and I could see Brenna making the same calculation, the math of a woman who'd been one ER visit from catastrophe for a long time. What would I have to do? She asked. Almost nothing, honestly. Log a few hours a week. Take some calls, it's mostly paperwork on my end. And we'd live here for free. As part of the job? I said. Yeah. My mother was over by 10 that morning because of course Brenna called her, and my mother thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Her good daughter finally stepping up. Her family taken care of. She kept saying it was what families do. I agreed with everything. I agreed so hard my face hurt. I told them I'd have the paperwork ready by end of day. I went into my office, closed the door, and got to work. And this is the part where I have to explain what I actually did because it's the whole spine of the thing. A lease creates a tenant. A tenant in this state has rights that take months and a court order to remove, even for non-payment. If I'd signed Brenna to a lease, even a sham one, I'd have handed her exactly the protection she didn't deserve. I would have made her a tenant in my own home and spent half a year and several $1,000s in legal fees getting her out. But an employee whose housing is a condition of employment is not a tenant. She's a licensee. It's the same legal category as a live-in nanny or a building superintendent who gets an apartment as part of the job. Her right to be in the house is tied to the job. End the job and the housing license ends with it. Not after a 6-month eviction proceeding, but more or less immediately because she was never a tenant in the first place. She was an employee with a perk, and the perk goes when the paycheck does. So I did not write a lease, I wrote an employment agreement. I wrote it carefully and I wrote it real. This wasn't some forgery, every clause in it was enforceable, which was exactly the point. The job was genuine, property caretaker for my 2 rental units, with duties listed in plain language. The compensation was genuine, an hourly wage, plus housing provided as a condition of employment, plus enrollment in the benefits package once the 90-day probationary period was complete. That last part mattered. The benefits she wanted most were the ones that didn't kick in for 90 days. People will sign almost anything for a prize that's 90 days away. And then, woven through the boring middle of the document, the clauses that mattered. That housing was provided solely as a condition of continued employment, and that termination of employment for any reason would result in the immediate revocation of the housing license, with the former employee required to vacate within 72 hours. That the employee consented to video monitoring of the common areas and the exterior of all properties, my home included, for security and liability purposes. That the employee authorized a standard background and credit check as a condition of the bonding required to handle tenant deposits at the rental units. That the employment was at will, as nearly all employment in this state is, meaning it could be ended by either party at any time for any reason or none. I printed 2 copies. I brought them out to the kitchen with a pen and the warm, slightly too bright energy of someone doing a kindness. Brenna read it the way people read documents they've already decided to sign. I skating across the surface looking only for the words she wanted. Salary, housing, benefits, dental. She asked about the hours again. I told her again it was nothing. She asked when the insurance kicked in and I pointed to the 90-day clause and watched her decide 90 days was nothing. She could do 90 days standing on her head. She signed it, Brenna Wexler, in looping blue ink, on the line above EMPL Loy EE. My mother witnessed it. I'd asked her to, framed it as wanting it all official and proper, and she signed the witness line with a flourish, beaming, because in her version of events, she had just watched her cold, practical daughter finally open her heart. In the version that was actually happening, she had just notarized the document that would put her son's family back on the street, and signed her own name to confirm she'd seen it done. I signed last, I dated it, I made copies, gave one to Brenna, kept the original in my office safe, and I told them all how excited I was, how glad I was we'd done this the right way. Then I said I needed to head back to Tucson for a few more days to finish the estate paperwork, which was a lie. I drove to a residence-style hotel 8 minutes away, the kind with a little kitchenette, and I checked in for a week. That night I opened the security app on my laptop and watched my own living room in high definition. I'd had the cameras for over a year, a doorbell cam, one in the kitchen, one covering the living room and the backslider. Standard stuff, the kind half of America has now. Brenna had signed her consent to all of it that morning without registering what she was consenting to. I want to be careful here because people ask me if it was legal to watch them, and the answer is yes. In this state, you can record video in the common areas of your own home, and she'd signed a consent on top of that. I never put a camera anywhere private. I didn't need to. The kitchen told me everything. It told me everything within about 6 hours. I watched Brenna on the phone, pacing my kitchen, a glass of my wine in her hand. The audio on the kitchen cam isn't perfect, but it's good enough. Doesn't even live here, basically, she was saying. She's got that hotel real estate job. She travels all the time. Cal says by the time the 90 days is up, she'll have forgotten she ever hired me. A laugh. I'm not doing any property anything. What's she going to do? Fire me? We'd just stay. She's not going to drag her own nephews out. I sat on the stiff little hotel couch with a club sandwich going cold next to me and I felt, I'll admit it, a flicker of something almost like grief. Not surprise. I'd known. But hearing it said out loud in my kitchen with my wine by someone I'd just cooked breakfast for, there's a difference between knowing a thing and watching it. Then she did something that turned the grief into focus. She hung up, glanced toward the hallway to make sure she was alone, and went to the mail. I have a slot in my front door that drops mail into a little basket in the entry, and I'd seen the basket overflowing when I arrived. Brenna had apparently appointed herself the keeper of it. She flipped through the stack standing up fast, and 3 or 4 envelopes she pulled out and folded and shoved into the inside pocket of her jacket, which was hanging on a kitchen chair. Then she put the rest of the mail back in the basket like nothing had happened. People don't hide bills they intend to pay. They hide bills they're running from. I leaned toward the screen and I felt the cold, clear quiet come down over me again. Because this wasn't part of my plan. This was something else, and I wanted to know what. The background check came back the next afternoon, and it answered the question. Brenna Wexler had a civil judgment against her. Not a pending case, a judgment, already entered, for a little over $19,000 owed to a property management company for back rent and damages on an apartment they'd been evicted from 2 cities ago. There was a collections agency attached, and there was a notation that the defendant's address was unknown for the purposes of enforcement, which is a polite legal way of saying she had skipped out and made herself hard to find. The collections agency couldn't garnish wages they couldn't locate and couldn't serve papers on a person with no fixed address on file. But a W-2 employee has an address on file. A W-2 employee has a verifiable employer, a documented wage, and a physical residence listed on her onboarding paperwork. By signing my employment agreement, Brenna hadn't just signed away her tenant protections. She'd signed herself out of hiding. She put her real name, her real address, and her real wages onto a document, and the moment that paperwork existed, she was findable. I sat with that for a long time. There's a version of me that would have used it cruelly. I want to be honest about that too. For one full evening, I sat in that hotel room and imagined the satisfaction of it, weaponizing a stranger's debt against her. But the debt wasn't mine to use, and the kids were real, and I am not, it turns out, the cold person my mother spent my childhood deciding I was. So I didn't go to the collections agency. Not the way you might think. What I did was wait 3 more days and let Brenna prove, on camera, in high definition, exactly who she was. She never logged an hour, of course she didn't. The rental units I'd supposedly hired her to manage went unwalked, uncalled, untouched. I had a tenant at one of those units email me about a leaking water heater on day 3, the kind of thing the caretaker was contractually responsible for handling, and Brenna, who had access to that email account because I'd given it to her as part of the job, simply did not respond. I have the timestamp. I have the unanswered email. I let the water heater sit, which cost me a few $100s in damage, and it was the best money I ever spent because it was documentation. It was a caretaker failing to perform the single core function of her job. I watched my brother too, those days. Calvin trying to be useful in his ineffective way, half-heartedly mowing my lawn, telling the boys to be careful with my things in a voice nobody listened to. I watched my mother come and go, presiding over it all, queen of a kingdom she'd stolen and handed to her favorite. I watched the 4-year-old draw on my hallway wall in marker while Brenna sat 10 feet away on her phone. I watched on the 5th night Brenna and my brother have a low fight in the kitchen about money, and I heard her tell him not to worry, that this was the most stable they'd been in years, that I was a soft touch and there was no reason it ever had to end. That was the line. No reason it ever had to end. That was when I closed the laptop and made the calls. I want to walk through exactly what I did, in order, because the order was the whole thing. First, I emailed Brenna a formal notice of termination of employment, effective immediately, for failure to perform the duties of her position, citing the unanswered tenant email, the unlogged hours, the unaddressed water heater. I attached the documentation. I CT'd nobody, this was just business, employer to employee. The email also stated, quoting the agreement she'd signed, that because her housing was a condition of employment, the housing license was now revoked and she had 72 hours to vacate the residence. Second, the moment that email sent, I changed the access. The smart locks I'd had installed when I bought the place, the ones my mother had paid a locksmith to drill out and rekey, I'd quietly had restored to a smart deadbolt the day after I checked into the hotel, while everyone was out at the boys' new school. New codes. New app control on my phone, only my phone. I disabled the codes I'd given Brenna. I didn't lock them out that minute, they were inside. But I took control of the doors back. Third, I called the rental tenant about the water heater and handled it myself, and made a note in my own records that the caretaker position was now vacant due to termination for cause. Paper, paper, paper. I was building a wall of it. Brenna called me 11 times in the first hour. I let it go to voicemail, and then I answered, once, on a recorded line, and I was very calm, and I said the thing I'd been waiting 2 weeks to say. You're not a tenant, Brenna. You never were. You were an employee, and I've ended your employment, and your housing ended with it. You have 72 hours. I'd use them to find a place for the boys. She screamed about squatters' rights. She'd been coached by somebody, maybe my mother, maybe a forum. She said I couldn't just put them out, that she had rights, that she'd been living there. I told her, gently, that squatters' rights and tenants' rights both require you to be something other than an at-will employee occupying housing as a condition of a job you signed a contract to do. I told her she was welcome to consult a lawyer and that I hoped she would, because any lawyer would tell her the same thing in 5 minutes and save us both the noise. My mother called next. I'll spare you most of it. The word she used most was heartless, and the second most was family, and somewhere in the middle she said the thing that I think she'll regret until she dies, which was, I gave that woman my word. And I said, you witnessed her contract, Mom. You signed it. You watched her agree to every word of it. You can read your copy. There was a silence on the line that I have never heard from my mother before or since. The silence of a person realizing she has been a tool in something she doesn't understand and helped build. They didn't leave it 72 hours. I didn't expect them to. People like Brenna treat every deadline as the opening bid in a negotiation. So at hour 73 I did the thing I'd kept in reserve, the thing that I think is either the smartest or the coldest thing I've ever done, depending on who's telling it. I didn't cut the power, I didn't lock the fridge or any of the dramatic things people imagine. What I did was simpler and completely legal. I exercised my rights as the employer and the homeowner to begin the formal trespass process, which in this state, against a person whose lawful right to occupy has ended and who is not a tenant, is a police matter and not a civil one. I had the contract. I had the termination notice. I had the 72-hour clause. I had video of her never working. I had a tenant email proving the job existed and she'd abandoned it. I walked into the precinct with a folder an inch thick, and I laid it out for an officer who actually read it, slowly, and then looked up at me and said, "She's not on a lease anywhere." "No," I said. "She's a terminated employee refusing to vacate company-provided housing. I have her signed acknowledgement that occupancy ends with employment." He made a phone call. The legal posture mattered enormously, and I built it on purpose. A squatter with kids is a civil headache. But a former employee who signed a document agreeing to leave when the job ended, and who is now refusing, is something the law has a much faster answer for. The folder was the difference. The contract was the difference. And then I did one more thing, and this is the part I'm least proud of and most at peace with. I called the collections agency that held Brenna's $19,000 judgment. I did not tell them anything untrue. I did not tell them anything I wasn't legally able to tell them. I simply confirmed, as her former employer, that she had been employed by me, that her employment had ended, and I provided the forwarding address she had given me on her onboarding paperwork as required by law, which was my mother's address, the one-bedroom, because that was the only other place these people had ever lived. I owed the collections agency that information. I'd have given it to anyone who asked. It just happened that nobody had been able to ask for 2 years, because Brenna had made herself unfindable, and I had unmade that. They were gone by the end of the week. There was no scene with police dragging children, which is what my mother predicted and what I'd taken pains to avoid. In the end, they packed the minivan in a sullen hurry over 2 days, with my brother avoiding the cameras he now knew were watching, and they drove to my mother's one-bedroom. All four of them, where I assume the dynamic that had run them out of 3 apartments resumed on a smaller stage. A process server from the collections agency found Brenna there within the month, because she finally had an address on file. The $19,000 is hers to deal with now, with interest, the way it always should have been. I had my house professionally cleaned. The marker came off the hallway wall with a special sponge and a lot of patience. I bought a new mattress because I could not sleep in the one Brenna had slept in, and the old one I gave away. I changed every code in the house one more time, just for me, for the feeling of it. My mother and I don't speak now. She tells the version where I am the villain who threw her grandbabies into the street, and she has an audience for it, because that version is more exciting than the true one. The true one is boring, the way most justice is boring. I didn't trap anyone. I offered my sister-in-law a real job with real benefits and real responsibilities, and she signed a real contract, and then she refused to do the job, and so the job ended, and the things attached to the job ended with it. Every door I closed, she had signed her name agreeing it could be closed. I just read the agreement and she didn't. People ask me if I feel guilty, and the honest answer is that I felt the worst on the night I watched her hide that mail, before I'd done anything at all. Because that was the night I understood she was a person drowning, and I made a choice not to let her grab onto me and pull me under. And choosing your own survival over someone else's grip is a grief even when it's right. What I learned and what I'd tell anyone is that the people who count on your goodness have already done the math. They've calculated exactly how much of yourself you'll surrender before you'll be the villain, and they live in that margin, comfortable, certain you'll keep paying. The only way out is to stop being predictable, not cruel, just no longer available to be used. My grandmother left me a little money in the end, and a note I found folded in her recipe box that said, in her shaky hand, "Be kind, but don't be furniture." I've got it framed in the hallway now, on the wall where the marker used to be, and some mornings I stand there with my coffee and read it, in my own quiet house, with the doors locked the way I want them, and nobody inside but me. The thing that nobody tells you about being the dependable one is that dependability gets mistaken for an open door. My mother didn't break into my house because she was cruel. She did it because 30 years of me never making a fuss had taught her that I was a resource with no lock on it. That's cause and effect, plain as anything. I trained her to expect compliance, and then one day I was surprised that she expected it. The eviction notices Brenna kept hiding, the 3 apartments they burned through, my mother's one bedroom that couldn't hold them. None of that landed on me by accident. It landed because I'd built a reputation for catching whatever fell, and people throw harder when they know someone's standing under them with open arms. I keep coming back to the breakfast I made for Calvin. The eggs, the bacon, the warmth I faked so well it scared me a little. I could have screamed that morning. I could have called the police that first night and felt righteous for an hour before they told me it was a civil matter and left. What stopped me wasn't softness. It was knowing the difference between the satisfaction that lasts an hour and the result that lasts forever, and being willing to sit in my own discomfort long enough to choose the second one. That patience is a muscle, and mine only got strong because life made me carry weight young. The girl who started working at 16 so she wouldn't add to the pile turned into the woman who could smile at a sister-in-law sleeping in her stolen bed because she knew the smile was a tool and the contract was the win. But none of the cleverness would have meant anything if I'd let it curdle into cruelty. I had Brenna's $19,000 judgment in my hand. I could have used it like a knife. I didn't, because the line between protecting yourself and punishing someone is real, and crossing it would have made me into exactly the kind of person my mother always claimed I was. I gave the collections agency only what the law already entitled them to. I offered Brenna a real job before I ever offered her an exit. Every door that closed on her, she had signed her own name agreeing it could close. So if you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Be good, but be good on purpose, not on autopilot, because automatic goodness is just a thing for people to stand on. Be smart enough to know the law and the fine print before your feelings get involved. And be tough enough to live through the days when doing the right thing feels exactly like doing the cruel thing, because that stretch is where most people fold and hand over the house. My grandmother's note is framed in my hallway now. Be kind, but don't be furniture. I read it some mornings with my coffee in my own quiet house, and I finally understand the whole sentence.